So let me open us with prayer. Sustaining God, make us more fully aware of your presence with us today. And by your Spirit, open our eyes, open our ears to what you would have us see and hear about all you have created and all the people who live in it. Trouble the waters of our complacency, that from what we learn today, our minds and our hearts might be more receptive to what you want us to do and who you want us to be in and for the world. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. So I'm going to share my screen and start with some slides about our theme for today, which is the final one, third session of the Matthew 25 series. So eradicating systemic poverty is the last one. So can everybody see those slides? You're seeing the screen now? Okay, good. So, and just overall, for anyone who hasn't been joining this series of 3 classes and the sermons, Matthew 25 is an initiative that Westminster joined in 2019 and calls us to actively engage in the world around us so our faith comes alive and we wake up to new possibilities of how to really live out our faith in and for the world. And these kind of initiatives include acting boldly and compassionately to see our neighbors through Jesus' eyes and to serve those who are marginalized or in need. So really trying to put skin on what it means to be the body of Christ in and for the world. And because it comes out of the Gospel of Matthew, caring for the least of these, it obviously is grounded in the gospel and not just in the Gospel of Matthew, but throughout kind of the Bible, starting back with the beginning of creation through the prophets and into the New Testament. So these ideas of feeding those who are hungry, caring for those who are sick, sheltering those without homes, welcoming strangers, and comforting those who mourn. And particularly in the prophets, we see a lot of focus on those who are at the margins, people who are very vulnerable at that time in history, widows, orphans, and those who are just barely getting by day to day. So Matthew 25 calls us to eradicate systems and structures that keep people and communities poor. That is our focus for today. What does it mean to address not just the immediate needs, but the systemic structures and systems that perpetuate these problems? So I'm going to just stop and show a very short clip just to get us thinking about what is systemic poverty and how we might articulate that in our own own words. So let me go to our video. This is really quick, so it's about.
What does poverty?
Well, wait a sec.
It looks like
You're not hearing that, are you? You're not hearing that and not seeing it yet. Okay, let me work on that. Hold on a sec.
You appear to not be sharing your screen.
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, I gotta share screen and find my video and share sound. All right, we'll try this again.
What does poverty really look like in America? It looks like the food service worker who can't afford food in a pandemic. It looks like the healthcare worker who can't afford their prescriptions. Like the childcare worker who can't afford childcare. Being poor in America is more than about a lack of money. It's about working hard and still not having access to the basic things so many of us take for granted. You can help eradicate systemic poverty through Matthew 25. Log on to find out more today.
So that's a really brief overview. So as you listen to that, what were the things beyond just not having money to buy food? As you think more broadly about systemic poverty, what did you hear?
not just food. I mean, it's healthcare, it's childcare. Housing inevitably would be involved. And I think some of the things we've been very aware of recently is a number of people, particularly low-income people who live in marginal housing who have been flooded, and they don't really have any option. You know, there was an article I was reading yesterday about places that they were flooded and then, or forest fires, you know, houses disappear, the pressure on housing goes up, the prices go up, there's no place to rent. Even an issue where people who are coming in to do remediation, you know, fill up all the hotel rooms, so there aren't even hotel rooms. Those aren't bad things innately, but they do exacerbate the problem of there's just no place to live in some areas. And I think we're seeing some of that in Chester County with the flooding from Ida. That devastation was just unbelievable.
It was horrendous, wasn't it? And there's a large percentage of households that can't absorb an emergency, you know, payout of money like that. I think $400 cutoff, and a lot of people cannot, you know, don't have the means to gather up that amount of money to address an urgent need of financial need. So, and other thoughts?
And I have a question, actually. The thing that clip didn't specifically address that I'm curious about is what distinguishes systemic poverty from any other kind of poverty? What does the word systemic mean in that context?
The idea that it's systemic is that it's kind of ingrained into our culture and it tends to perpetuate itself. So it's within the institutions and the structures that we have in and around us as well. Yeah, Susan?
That's what I was going to comment on, is the idea that there aren't systems in place to alleviate some of these issues. Therefore, as you say, perpetuating the poverty. I mean, just take a look at childcare, and you know, both of my kids happen to have young children that are in childcare, and good childcare is incredibly expensive. I mean, it's just insanely expensive, and all the children whose parents can't go back to work because they can't afford to do that, you know. And an idea of even a minimum wage of $15 an hour can't support even one person, much less a family. And I think that we just don't have any of those systems in place. Healthcare, drug prices, insane. And for those of us who are lucky and can manage these things, maybe not do well with them, but can manage them, it's one thing. But how many people for whom, you know, a high-priced drug is just, they can't do it. They have no money for it.
Thanks, Susan. Katie?
Well, I think we're on the cusp of help here from our government on systemic things. And hopefully that, even though we are not getting everything that would help us, I feel there's a commitment to work for that. And that's where I feel for myself, it's important to put efforts to keep the pressure on legislators and so forth while we have this chance, which I think is a narrow window. And I don't know if the church is getting involved. I don't mean our church, I mean the church writ large is getting involved with this because it is a political issue. But anyway, I think there's hope out there that some of these things are being addressed and will be addressed on top of what we in our own local area can do.
I thought it was very hopeful to see the photographs of President Biden with Pope Francis, that there is, I think, this joining of church and political policies going forward, that maybe we can bring all of that energy and effort and wherewithal together to address some of these systemic issues. Nick, did you have something?
Yeah, I'll make one comment about the Biden Pope thing, and then I have another comment to make. The fact that the Pope told him it's fine for him to have communion is a tremendous step for the Catholic Church, because many dioceses were saying that Joe was a sinner because of things he's done, and then he was receiving communion, et cetera, et cetera. The Pope giving him basically the right to have communion and saying it to the whole church shows the ability to forgive, the ability not to hold the law to the letter, and the ability to show some kind of broadness and understanding what people go through. So I wanted to make that comment. The other comment I wanted to make about poverty is it's important we all realize it can happen to anyone. That you could be wealthy one day and have millions of dollars in the bank or in stock investments and all kinds of things. And a short time later, find yourself behind the eight ball financially. I've seen it happen with friends who were in the stock market and only in a few stocks, and then the market took a dive. I saw men who had businesses who all of a sudden their markets dried up and they lost everything. The line between being rich and being poor can be very fragile. And I think it's important we all realize that, except for the grace of God, there goes I. It could be any of us who are in poverty, any of us who are victims of systematic.
Thank you. Welcome, Julie. We're just getting started on this conversation about eradicating systemic poverty. So any other thoughts, comments?
Not necessarily directed at systemic poverty, but I think that last hymn should be required reading for anybody. Assuming that all basic faithful people espouse to the same tenets of helpfulness and loving your neighbor. And I think that that is consistent across the major religions of the world. That should be required, on the wall, because it, to me, really hit home and on what we say and what we do. As, maybe not as individuals particularly, but certainly as groups of people.
Can I just ask real quickly the title, since I wasn't in church, and it's probably in the bulletin, isn't it?
It's
so I can look
hymn
it up.
345. It's called "In an Age of Twisted Values." It's not one that we sing. I don't know that we've ever sung it before, but it's a familiar tune that new words were written to. So, and as Nancy is saying, the words are very powerful. And that's why Jenny selected it. And unfortunately, the words were not being displayed for those of you who are joining us online.
And it's got 4 flats and it's tough to sing.
It's not the easiest to sing. So thankfully we had the choir there leading the way. But I can probably get those lyrics for you and send them to you so you could read through them. They're very powerful. Welcome, Betsy. So just getting started on eradicating systemic poverty.
Good. It takes me a while to get home. So
I know. Yeah, it's a challenge with the timing on Sunday morning, trying to fit everything in. Well, let me continue with our slides as we move through this conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll go back to systemic poverty. Okay, so and what Larry brought up is like, what does it mean to be systemic? So poverty is complex and overlaps with many other social ills and oppressive structures in our society and world. So you can see this circle of poverty. So if a family is living in poverty and not having the financial means to care abundantly for one another, then the child grows up in poverty. There's a significant disadvantage in educational skills. And then obviously, as the child is not well educated, possibly may struggle to get a job that pays more than minimum wage in Pennsylvania, I think is $7.25. It has not been raised since I don't know how many decades. And then fail to escape the poverty cycle. And then this just kind of continues. You just get trapped in this structure and this cycle that never seems to end unless there's some way of, whether it's the church or policies, changing something that will break that cycle and will be, able to get them out of that ongoing loop of poverty. So this comes from the World Bank, as it describes poverty in a very broad way. So poverty is hunger, poverty is lack of shelter, poverty is being sick and not being able to see a doctor, poverty is not having access to school and not knowing how to read, poverty is not having a job, is fear for the future, and living one day at a time. Poverty is losing a child to illness brought about by unclean water. Poverty is powerlessness, lack of representation, and freedom.
And so many of our legislators are trying to emphasize the last.
And that really gets to the heart of so many of the aspects of what it means not to have the financial means that so many of us enjoy. As we were talking about the flooding from Hurricane Ida, when there's an emergency like that, many of us have insurance that we can fall back on. We have friends or relatives, if we don't have the financial means ourselves, that we can get help. But so many people don't have those benefits. And then you can see how once you lose your housing, it's hard to maintain a job. It's hard to keep your kids in school. If you don't have a car, if your car was flooded by those torrential rains, then you have no way to get to work. And it's very hard to get yourself out of that situation without the help of public policies. And we'll talk more about the kind of charity aspect that a lot of faith communities do, as opposed to we really need our government to be making broader. And as Katie was pointing out, there is hope that that is beginning to happen for us. So eradicating systemic poverty obviously is no small task. We can eradicate systemic poverty by acting on our beliefs and working to change laws, policies, plans, and structures in our society that perpetuate economic exploitation of people who are poor. And sadly, of the G7, so the top 7 industrialized democracies of the world, the United States has the highest level of income inequality. And so it's very difficult, because I think some of what we're fighting and addressing is the greed that we experience in our culture. And there are people who have a voice around the table to make a change, but then choose not to because the status quo is more comfortable for them. And how do we then give a voice to people who don't have access to the areas in our political system that might bring about change? So for those who were not in worship, I'm going to show the full video from the Matthew 25 resources that Jenny shared, about a 3-minute clip of it that was edited. And we're going to take almost 5 minutes to watch this video. It just gives us an idea of what another congregation is doing to address the situation. And, you know, as you watch it, think about, you know, where is the charity and the justice? So how does that balance out in what they're doing and how they approach this? Let's see here. Share screen. Oops. To find the right video. There we go.
Los Angeles County has about 60,000 homeless. About 2/3 are living on the streets or in tents, and we've seen it right here to one of our own members. John, we were seeing him every Sunday here at the church. We stopped seeing him from time to time, found out he was living in his car, found out he lost his car, was ending up on the streets.
And I found him at the homeless camp, and I just started bringing him food.
She started going to the encampment about 10 minutes from our church, and she came and said to me, "Becky, you've got to go to the encampment with me."
And so we started going to the camp, and we had our compassion for the people that we met there. It was a real eye-opener to see how people lived.
You care so much, and you feel like, what can I do? And it's such a big problem. But then you know that just the little things that you can do.
The mighty women of St. Mark's.
All we did was being there.
They do more. The women do more. They're coming out here and they're only giving them water and food and clothes, but they're helping them make their mental health appointments. That's crucial. You know what I mean? They're helping them make their housing appointments to get off the streets. That's crucial.
These people are respected when they're here. There's no messing around with these people. They come, they help us. We're grateful for it. Today's a big day for me. I'm about to leave this homeless camp and move into my own place.
We're working to alleviate poverty. How do you do that? Well, you teach people skills in terms of budgeting, setting goals for their life, thinking about education. Do they want to further their education? What about employment?
Oh, I'm grateful, very grateful for Becky. And she's been, if it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't be housed. I moved like 10 miles down now. I'm in LA, and I'm in a studio, which I'm having to pay close to $1,200 to stay in.
So they're living isolated from their close friends, their family, their support system. So we felt strongly we needed to have support for the people there in order to help them stay housed.
I lived with my boyfriend for 5 years. He was a verbally abusive alcoholic. When I tried to get a place of my own, there was nothing within my reach. Not a room to rent, not a garage, not the trunk of a car, or a square in a driveway that I could afford, making $19 an hour, mind you. This is where we have come because we had nowhere else to go, because we had nobody else to turn to, and because our pain is so great that we don't know how else to deal with it except to try to numb it so that we cannot think about what's causing it for just a little while, even if it's just 5 minutes of peace without the pain.
Yeah, I think of the Good Samaritan, how people walked by and they saw the guy who was hurt and they went away. Well, that was the way I was for a long time. I would see the camps, I'd see people, and I'd walk on the other side. I didn't want to be involved. We don't think that we can eradicate poverty, just the 5 of us, but that we could do our part.
But everyone at the homeless encampment is concerned with issues of food, of drink, of shelter, of health. And that is a Matthew 25 effort all by itself.
Matthew 25 has really energized our congregation in amazing ways.
Especially letting those homeless that we have the relationship with know that there's something bigger, broader. It's not just about these 5 ladies at this church, but there are other people committed to that, other people committed to being part of eradicating poverty, addressing racism, and to the revitalization of church. Can it happen? I think if enough people care. It'd be a very challenging task. But we've got someone up there on our side. How could it not?
So I'm just closing that out. So how could it not? Yeah.
I wish that she would have shown the entire thing.
I agree. I think the edited version left out some really important.
Okay, well, say more about that. what would you have hoped? What did you think? So what got edited was down to about 3 minutes, and I think the timing was an issue. So what do you think that the 2 minutes that got edited out, what do you think was lost?
I think
Examples of impacts on real people.
right, and I
Yeah.
think that her just listening to that young woman explain that, to people who have so much of everything as we do. I think that was really critical, and a lot of people don't have any contact with people like that, so they don't get it. They judge them from where they stand, and some of those people are bad, wrong, or stupid because they don't do what they do.
I think.
Oh, go ahead, Susan.
I think personally, the two things that were not in what we saw in worship this morning were, as Betsy said, the woman explaining, and here's a woman making $19 an hour. So many people would say, well, you've got a good wage. And yet that comes out to, if you work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and never take a day off, that comes out to $39,520. And if the other woman is paying $1,200 a month for a studio, I mean, it just doesn't compute.
No.
And I know rents in Westchester are insane. Ken and I were just talking about that the other day, about how, it's more than a mortgage payment.
And the guideline is that no more than 30% of your income should be spent on housing, because you do need to allow for medical care, for food, for clothing, for transportation, to save, all of those things. Yeah, and I think too often we think about people who are unhoused and dealing with a situation of homelessness, that we attribute that just to substance abuse and addictions. And she helps us to kind of understand that because you're in a situation like that, you may drink too much to numb the situation. But as Nick pointed out earlier, that's not usually the case that causes someone to lose their home. It's often, a relationship change, a divorce, it's a health issue, you've lost your job, no fault of your own, that you end up not being able to pay your rent or your mortgage, and you can see how easily you could slide into a situation where you can't afford housing. Many people will keep their car and then live in their car, and then just kind of, float from one couch to another, from friends and family, and, not really have a home of their own, but at least have shelter. And that's when we support Family Promise, Family Promise, just emergency shelter. That's the idea that, it's not the ideal situation, because they're going from, when we're doing the rotation, from one church setting to the next, but at least they are in a place that is safe and warm, and they're receiving meals. And they also receive the social services that will help them, think about, well, what's the next step? How do you get out of this cycle of continuing to need people to care for you and not being self-sufficient? Most people, want to care for themselves. They want to have a job. They want to be able to earn an income that will, affordable housing and pay for their food and help them raise their children. So any other thoughts about that video? So that the justice and the charity, as you heard those women talk about their experience, what did you hear about their journey?
I mean, the thing that strikes me is how painful it is. People who are in that kind of cycle of poverty, and they're living in tents and living in the car, I mean, the pain and anguish they're going through is enormous. They don't want to live like that. They know people looking down on them. The ability to pull yourself up is really difficult. But I just think the pain is palpable.
And what that one woman went through with the abuse is painful enough, and then it multiplies. I know my daughter, one of my daughters went through an abusive alcoholic relationship and has finally gotten out of it, and I'm helping her. Then in addition to that, she had the carotid artery dissection. And so she hasn't really been able to work. Thank goodness that she's not paralyzed, because a lot of times that happens. But she's getting better. She has, some neurological issues, but it seems like they're getting a little bit better. Like when she goes and into a wide open space, she gets kind of dizzy. And but anyway, I'm fortunate enough to be able to help her and her family through this. And you know, she does have a restraining order, and so I can appreciate the pain of that woman.
Yeah.
Very
And
difficult.
just think, Nancy, if she didn't have you.
Right.
Yeah, well,
Right.
yeah,
Exactly.
I'm so grateful. I'm
Exactly.
so grateful.
Thanks.
And my other daughter too. I'm helping her and her family.
Mhm.
These are difficult times. Yeah.
I was also very impressed by the woman who was the church member who said, you know, I had seen this before, and you tend to walk by, and I think that's very true. We do. You know, it's difficult. You don't want to see that. So I have to give them a tremendous amount of credit for really being willing to go into that encampment, which has to be a difficult thing to do. And to realize how much these people need that sort of help.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most remarkable things. Oh, go ahead, Betsy.
There are two things. I agree with you exactly what you said, Susan. Your eyes are opened all of a sudden. It's not something out of a textbook or something that you read about online or something. It's the reality of what that is, and so in the despair that they face. And so those women all of a sudden had their eyes opened, and that's like compassion, and it's empathy for what these people are suffering. The second thing is, if you have not watched on Netflix the movie Maid, MAID, please do.
Oh, I've heard of it.
Oh God, it is extremely powerful. And I've known people in the situation that the young woman in the story finds herself. And I couldn't, and I've been on the one side of social service too. So, because I had kids in detention, that's what I taught that for 13 years. So to me, it was so powerful. I could only watch one session at a time, one episode at a time, but it's really very good. And you get very involved with the character and what she faces and how she does not have the backup of her parents, Nancy, the way you supported your daughter. And that's so significant, and it shows that in that story. So watch that; it'll be very meaningful to you, I think.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
Well, another thing that I thought was important was that when they went in, they started with food and that kind of thing, but began to realize it was skills that people needed, and that they continued their work along that line.
Right.
That's a great point. That was one of the key takeaways for me. As you're saying, Susan and Betsy, they really made themselves vulnerable. And it took a lot of courage probably to go and to be with those people at the encampment. It's not our place of comfort and familiarity by any means. And they were able to, more fully experience, and I think, just be very vulnerable in what they learned and in building relationships with the people that they encountered. So they may have started kind of from just that charity mindset of, I want to make sure they have food and clean water to drink. But then, as Katie's pointing out, then as they got to know these people and they were in conversation and more fully understood why is it that you're living in this encampment, and realizing that there were mental health appointments that they needed to make and to keep, and that there were jobs, that they needed to go and to interview, and then housing that they needed to negotiate, and trying to navigate all of those different systems is very challenging on a good day for any of us. But, when you're living in an encampment under those situations, and possibly without, a good education or even the ability to read, could feel insurmountable.
I think it's interesting, the role of COVID, pumping up hourly wages, and the role of business being kind of forced to address some of these issues, not necessarily poverty, but people in poverty or in low-paying jobs have some stepping stones that they're able to take advantage of. I guess I found that interesting and good.
And just access to a computer.
Yes.
That's huge. I mean, these people, trying to apply for jobs, everything is online. If you don't have access to a computer, and sometimes you can't get that at the library, or, for a long time you couldn't even get in the library. So that's critical, to be able to do anything, to get any kind of, even take a course online or something, to get your GED, any of that kind of stuff, where you have this deficit, and it's overwhelming. It's very overwhelming.
It's one of the harsh critiques of people who are in a situation of homeless, that, well, why do they have an iPhone? Like, how can they afford a phone if they're, they can't afford but if you don't have a phone in this world, this day and age, you can't access anything. So that is their lifeline to any, getting a job, getting housing, getting healthcare, is having that phone. So above anything else, they will maintain that phone if at all possible.
That's right.
I would say the ability to have a cell phone today is as important as having gasoline and food.
Yep.
Doctor's appointments, all kinds of things are only by cell phone now.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have a cell phone, it's as bad as not having food or gasoline.
Just a quick note, which has nothing to do with poverty, but Ken and I were in Williamsburg for a few days, and on our way home, we stopped at a restaurant in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and we parked in a high-rise parking thing. And the only way you can park there is with a cell phone, because you get a ticket and then you have to scan it and you pay over your phone. So, I mean, a minor point, not a big deal for us. And I understand these people probably are not going to parking lots, but your point is well taken, Nick, that it's an essential part of life.
And you can see our society going that way too. I mean, some of the stores where you can only pay with a credit card or with your phone, but what if you don't have that? What if all you have is cash? How can you not accept cash?
Well,
so yeah,
and your cash can get ripped off so easily. And these places are absolutely, they're all desperate. So they're being robbed all the time. And that's another piece of this. They're very, very, very vulnerable. And when you're out in the middle of you're in an encampment in a tent, you're really vulnerable. And if you're a woman, you're even more vulnerable. It's just a huge issue. This story she does have a phone, and you'll see how important that is to her survival. And the place that she does wind up in, a shelter, is all full of black mold. And then, she loses that support. I mean, it's just an incredible story. I hope that you watch it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for letting us know about it.
Yep.
Something simple that we could do. I just had to upgrade my phone in order to get certain things that I wanted. So I have a phone that I'm finished using, and I set it back to factory settings. And I took out the SIM card for my new phone. You need that in order to make calls. But how many of us have old phones that we are looking for a place to donate? Maybe our church could do something like that.
Great idea.
That is a great idea. Yeah. Wanted to mention, I just heard recently, this era of people leaving the workforce is the great resignation that, and companies, I think, as Katie's pointing out, are going to feel some pressure to increase benefits and pay to their employees to keep people in their companies, in their stores, in their offices. So hopefully that will give us, the employees, a little more clout, because there were a lot of people making, serious money during the pandemic. And then the majority of people really struggling. So there's such inequality in our country. Sorry, Betsy?
Some of them went into space.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Hello. We all on Amazon,
Well, and what about, I always thought John Deere was a good company, but the people were striking, and it turns out that they gave their higher people big raises and just left everyone else out. So I'm so disappointed that that would happen. I mean, I was so grateful to work for a small, closely held oil trading company, and when the company didn't do all that well, the president and the vice president didn't take a salary, but they paid us and we got our bonuses.
Mhm.
So grateful to have honest people that, you know,
Mhm.
I've worked for several companies like that.
Mhm.
But when I heard John Deere and how they gave, you know, their upper echelon huge raises and just didn't pay attention, I was flabbergasted.
Mhm. And that's another step that we all can be taking, is to really research the companies that we support. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I want to jump on this issue about corporations and how they really do contribute to systematic poverty. I've been doing a personal study of Home Depot. Home Depot pays most of their employees $12 an hour. Now, you heard about the lady there who said she's getting paid $19 in Los Angeles. The cost of living in Los Angeles is much higher than it here is in Pennsylvania. Probably people at $12 an hour here are doing better than people who get $19 in Los Angeles. But when you look at Home Depot, during the COVID, they moved up 50 places on the Fortune 500 list. The stock has jumped over $300 a share. And I think what's going on is they're trying to hold down their costs and their labor costs particularly, so they can sell the business to a large corporation either in China or in Germany. So here they are underpaying their employees by a huge amount. So their stock can jump up hundreds of dollars during COVID. They jump up in place. They're doing it on the backs of employees who are making $12 an hour. That contributes to systematic poverty. People at the top are making millions and millions of dollars just in profit sharing and all kinds of investment, stock investments. To pay people $12 an hour is unconscionable.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, we need to figure out, you know, what does it mean to pay people a livable wage, and then hold our corporations to that they need to be providing not just a livable wage, but benefits and, you know, that healthcare and everything that people need to survive in this world. Home Depot also was one of those essential businesses that was able to stay open during the whole pandemic too. So,
but here's, you know, there's also a lot of hypocrisy. You know, one of the things that strikes me about Home Depot is if you go out to the one in Sudbury on Route 30, about 25 miles from Lancaster, they never made anybody who was Amish wear a mask. And the reason was because they gave so much money to Home Depot and all the construction work they do. They didn't dare say that to the Amish, you have to wear a mask. Now the Amish, of course, were declaring that this is part of their religion. They trust in God. They don't believe in masks. But they didn't do that with any other group. They only did it with the Amish because the Amish produce so much business.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, I'm going to go back to our slides here. Share the screen. So we watched the video. Here's some questions to keep in mind, and maybe we'll have time at the end to talk more about them. What does it mean to address poverty in both individual and systemic ways? And can you think of examples of each? Where, when, and how have you seen, or can you imagine Jesus revealed in the church's work of eradicating systemic poverty? But before we answer those, I just want to go through some more of these slides, mindful of our time. So just a reminder about God's abundance in creation. And this is an image of Jesus feeding the 5,000. So Jesus shows us that a radical redistribution of resources feeds thousands, and he demonstrates abundance. And we see that not just in this story, but throughout the Gospels of God has supplied enough for everyone. And it's the, you know, the greed, the need to better distribute the resources fairly and equitably that keep everyone from experiencing that abundance. Just want to talk a little bit about extreme poverty. So this is a different definition of the, not so much what we would see in the United States, but in India and other parts of the world, in Africa, in which it's measured by those living on less than $1.90 a day. And that amount is understood to be the barest minimum required to sustain life. So this is, you know, the worst case scenario of someone living in poverty. Globally, the number of people living in extreme poverty declined from 36% in 1990 to 10% in 2015. Obviously a great achievement, although more than 700 million people are still living in extreme poverty. But we were going in the right direction, and it was a focus for a lot of different organizations and many of the countries in the world. There is still this desire to try to end poverty and hunger everywhere by 2030. That's getting closer every year. This is one of the hopes of Rise Against Hunger, is ending hunger by 2030. And we participate twice a year and with that organization to package meals that get distributed throughout the world. And along with just providing the meals, they also encourage children of families to send their children to school. So the children get fed the Rise Against Hunger meals at school. And then when they leave for the day, they also are given a bag of meals to take home for their family. So it encourages parents to keep their kids in school so they will have an education. So the progress ended with the COVID-19 pandemic. So last year, 115 million people were added to that number of people living in extreme poverty. And then in 2021, the estimate is that that will be another 150 million people will be added to that definition of extreme poverty. And then a little bit about specifically in the United States. These are the 10 hungriest states in the nation. So, and the average is around 14% of all states, 14% of the households of all states. Yeah, am I saying that right? 14% of household is the average for the United States risk of hunger. Yeah, and this comes from Bread for the World. And if you're not familiar with that organization, it is wonderful. They do a lot of work to not only make people more aware of what hunger is and how it looks in the United States and throughout the world, but how we might advocate and change the situation and better address people who are going hungry in the day. And they are the organization that we partner with to do the offering of letters. Obviously, there's this connection between nutrition and having a better tomorrow. So if children can stay in school because they're not needed to work to have enough money for the home, if they can be fed so they can learn well when they're in school and pay attention, that will give them a better tomorrow. A lot of people think, well, why do we need, I guess, probably no one on this call, but sometimes people think, well, can't the churches do it? Can't communities of faith address the hunger in around us, in our communities and in the world? But this diagram illustrates, so only 1 in 10 bags, so 1 entire unit of food assistance comes from a charitable organization. So federal nutrition programs provide the rest. So this is why it is so important that we advocate and we pay attention to the public policies, what our government is doing and what they are putting in place or potentially removing, because the majority, 90% of the support comes from the government and not from you and I working at Westminster to help address these issues. So they're huge, as we're saying, systemic problems that need to be addressed by the government. So one takeaway for today is a fish story. If one fish winds up on the shore, one may ask, what's wrong with this fish, this particular fish? Why is it on the shore? But if a whole school of fish washes up on the shore, one must ask, what's wrong with the water? And I think as we think about poverty and hunger and homelessness, when we see this systemic, ongoing, and very wide impact that these issues are having, not just on one individual, but on a whole section of humanity, we really need to start asking, what is wrong with the world? What is wrong with our structures, our governments, our practices, that whole segments of our population are struggling and not having any means of breaking that cycle. So our society does tend to focus just on the one fish, and we try to fix individual people who end up on the margins. And while it's important to respond with compassion to each person who is impoverished, the bigger question is what's causing them to end up and remain there. And I think like the women from St. Mark's, and, as we go out and we're with people and our eyes are open and we become more aware, and whether it's through a movie like Made, or however, we read or we hear on the radio, and we start to think, why is this happening? So, and when you start to hear about the repetition and the themes and, just asking and pondering and reflecting and being prayerful about then what is my role in responding? And I think that's what can get challenging at times. It's like, well, what do I do? And it can feel very overwhelming. So here are a few ideas. And starts with kind of our initial response is the charity is hunger alleviation, providing food in a dignified way. And Westminster does that. If you think about the Westchester Food Cupboard, the Kennett Square Food Cupboard, Safe Harbor, Meals for Safe Harbor. We do have a gleaning garden, so trying to provide food. And then the second is development assistance. So kind of addressing more the root causes would be the homelessness, providing shelter through Family Promise. We do have a home team right now working on affordable housing. So providing more access to housing in our area. And then the third one is hunger education. So is, watching movies like Made, or reading, becoming more aware. And the resources for a Matthew 25 congregation are a great way, great place to start. So you can go online. There are more videos like the ones we have been lifting up through these past 3 weeks. The fourth is a lifestyle integrity, that it may take us changing our own lifestyles to make an impact. One of the things is we are an Earth Care congregation now. So thinking about care of the earth, as climate change gets worse, there will be a significant ecological injustice that the people who are living on the margins, the poorer people, are going to feel this first and worst, and they'll have the fewer resources to deal with it. So how then can we live in a different way that might be a positive impact? So kind of the idea of eating lower on the food chain, not so much red meat, which it takes a lot of resources to feed cattle. So if we can eat more grains and fruits and vegetables, things like that. Can we buy fair trade items? So what might we do to change our lifestyle? And then the corporate and public policy, we've talked about that. How do we advocate for changes in policy and practices? The PCUSA does have an Office of Public Witness, which is really the taking the issues that have come up at General Assembly, the decisions that have been made, and putting those into practice and implementing them. So if the Presbyterian denomination is concerned about poverty and hunger, then what does that look like in public policy? And that office does that work for us. And then worship. So how do we continue to raise these issues in worship through sermons, through videos, through prayers, and litanies? And so as we kind of close out, thinking about what are the root causes of hunger and poverty in our community, what ways do you see Westminster working to address these issues? And are there additional ways that you think we need to be thinking about systemic poverty so we can better address them? Let me stop there. Oh, and this is, if you haven't voted yet, go out and vote. So,
I've been a poll worker ever since I retired.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Nancy. So we're kind of at the end of our time there, but is there anything that you want to share about particularly Westminster? So what do you see us doing and what do you think we could do better? Yeah, Julie.
Yes, thank you. Two things. Number one, besides making sure they get nutritious food, and clean water. We need to spend more, and I think one of your lists suggested it, but we need to spend an equal amount on teaching these people who are on the margins how to get out of poverty. There is a wonderful organization, and I seldom get the flyer anymore, but instead of just sending in money, you bought them a cow. Or you bought them a flock of chickens, but it was something that was to help them feed themselves. So it was a joyous thing to be a part of. And quite frankly, if I can just project a bit, because my family was a Depression family and my father refused welfare. So it was all a matter of my mother's garden. She grew up in a farm and she knew how to sustain us with magical things on the table. So that's just my comment. And one other one, I never got to sign into this Zoom until 11:42. I don't know why. They wouldn't let me talk. They wouldn't let me listen. They wouldn't do anything for me.
Did you had trouble accessing the meeting?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry for
got
that.
it
We
at
saw
11.
you initially, you were in initially, and then I don't know why it dropped you.
The audio, there was no audio. All I could see is half of the faces.
Oh, I'm sorry for that, Julie. That's always frustrating. I think what you're remembering is the giving catalog. So the Presbyterian denomination has an opportunity that we can indeed purchase, you know, some chickens or a goat or a pig or whatever, sewing machines, fishing nets. So items that would help a family to become more self-sufficient.
And it also protects their dignity.
Yes, because they have a way to earn their living. Yes. And micro loans are a wonderful way of doing that. You can research that. If we can give a family, and particularly if they have found that if you give the woman, the mother, the head of the household, often the means to, maybe it's buying, you know, water filtration, and she can produce clean water for the community and sell that. Or a sewing machine, or a flock of chickens to sell eggs, that will raise the family, and that will eventually raise the community out of situations of poverty. Yeah, Betsy.
Yes, thank you.
A couple things. The Mennonite Church is very big on assistance, you may know, and 10,000 Villages, which is it's sponsored by them, or it's from them. That money goes directly from them, from when you purchase, to the artist, and not to a middleman making a profit. And that's hugely important, because a lot of women who are doing handcrafts at home and stuff to support their families are benefiting directly from that kind of money. So I urge you to buy small this year. Don't go out to all the big box stores, because they're not going to be in anyway. But that's a really good thing to go do. And the other thing I was going to say was, I think it's important for us to learn how to walk. And this is a piece that would take us some time to learn how to walk side by side with these people, because that's what they need a lot of times. They need the side by side, hand over hand support that we who have, quote, made it in society, or know the ropes in society, or have contacts and can network, we are the ones who really can help tremendously in a lot of that, and especially navigating some of the governmental channels, which are, that's almost impossible to figure that stuff out. So I think that's something Westminster could really do a lot of, is walking side by side with folks who have a problem.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, so fair trade is an important thing to keep your eye on as we do our shopping this year. Yeah, Nick.
I think there's a tendency in most churches to try to remain neutral and objective on a lot of social and political issues, worrying that they may lose half their congregation if they take a point of view. But I think there are sometimes when issues are so important that churches do have to be an advocate. And they do have to echo Jesus's own words about there are rights and wrongs. And I think when it comes to what's going on in corporations, churches need to put more pressure on them to really contribute more to breaking these cycles of poverty. And to give you an example, you know, one time the textile industry was really big in New England. It got too expensive in labor in New England, so they moved it to the South. It got too expensive in the South, so corporations now move manufacturing and textiles to Vietnam, to China, to Mexico, again, where they can pay people an extremely low wage. Your movie said $1.19 an hour. There are places I know that people are getting only paid 90 cents an hour. And why do corporations do this? To increase their profit. And they make more and more money, but they don't give back to society in a broader way. And I think Westminster needs to put pressure where it can on corporations, because that's where it can make a big, faster difference. People with a better wage to contribute more to the betterment of society, instead of using it.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of clout as far as buying, our purchasing power of where do we spend our money. And if you want to do that next step of, where was this product made? Before I buy it, let me find out how the people who are making this item are treated and how are they paid. And that's helpful, Nick. Thank you. I think Nancy Crablin had something before you.
Two things. I think Heifer International is another organization that Julie was kind of referring to, where you can, I'm sure that your $500 doesn't necessarily buy a cow, but in the organization, they identify where particular animals can be productive and so forth. So I think that they have done good things. Echoing what Nick said, I was not super involved with Family and Promise, but I was one of the overnighters and stayed about once a month. And indeed, you became acquainted with people from across the spectrum, people who had lost their business from embezzlement, international, to people who were just in the more stereotypical situation of the margins, not English speakers. I think the impact on children, if children are raised with that being the norm of how you live, it's much harder for them to have a different model from themselves in the future. And a third point also worked a little bit with Bridge of Hope. Even if individuals identify that they can't do things on their own, they need to be fully ready to accept other people assisting them in walking that path. And they are not always ready. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Now, it can be a personality issue, I think, probably, but I think there's also it's hard to say you can't. That's hard. And I think we've all perhaps seen that in small things, but in big things, like I just can't keep a roof over my kid's head, that's hard.
Yeah, Larry? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would amplify something Nick said about corporate stuff and point out that Tuesday is election day, just as a sort of a reminder, and you need to engage with the people who represent you at various levels of the government, not just in terms of voting. Certainly that's there, you should vote, but writing letters or getting to know your representatives at whatever level seems possible, and trying your best to influence them so that the piece of this that is parallel to corporate issues is government, I'll say, unwillingness to address a lot of this stuff and try and influence the people who are the government in ways that...
The reason is because corporate lobbyists give so much money.
It is absolutely
politicians.
That's what I was going to say. That's what I was going to say.
You still have to go after the individuals and be certain that they understand what you think, and do your best to persuade them in whatever ways seem appropriate to do kind of the right thing.
And when looking at a lot of offices, if you can't personally engage, try to interpret from what they have written, what they're saying between the lines. If what they're saying between the lines is, some of my friends may disagree with my decisions, they may be affiliated with groups that have very narrow perspectives on, various social issues. And referring to Nick's corporate things, it is very difficult to find out what corporations support. Now, I wrote to Home Depot because they were one of the large corporations in Georgia that did not publicly come out and say, hey, these voting restrictions are wrong. I wrote to them. They did not respond. We did not walk into Home Depot for months. I confess, we've crossed the threshold. And I said specifically in my letter, their local staff is wonderful. They are helpful. They serve the public. But as a corporate entity, I think it's your responsibility to make sure people can vote.
Yeah.
And if you looked at those poverty statistics and the really aggressive in my opinion, anti-people and anti-voting, Texas, Kentucky, North Carolina, Georgia, those states have huge poverty rates, and yet their federal representatives are very staunchly voting against or trying to lobby against or limit the voting rights of the people in those states.
Right.
Now, what can we do? I write to my senators and representatives, and sometimes I realize I am throwing something at a really thick concrete block wall, because he will come back with statements that are like, duh.
Yeah.
I still keep writing. You usually get a real person in the Allentown office, and I say, you will listen to me until I am done.
It's great, Nancy.
It makes a difference, but it's all you can do.
That's why they're elected. Yep, their job is to represent us. Exactly.
But they don't.
They don't.
But a lot
And
of
it's really-
times when you call, you get this list of what you can talk about.
Yeah.
And that's not, it's very often it's what you want to talk about is not on that
On the
list.
list.
And when you email, voting rights is not on the email list.
And I thought it was very interesting in that chart that gave the 10 hungriest states in the US are the states where their representatives and senators are voting against all this stuff.
And
Does that make sense to anyone? I don't know. I don't understand that. It's because we've caused such a cultural divide in our country.
Exactly. And that, and that goes back to the beginning sessions of this with systemic racism. And that's what it's all about. So it's all building upon itself. And then we have this cycle of poverty that people can't get out of. And that's been going
Look,
on.
and I'm gonna hate myself for saying this, but these legislators think they are representing people who think our elections are unfair. They think they are representing the people. They think they're doing their job. Because they don't represent what we say, they think they are.
And they are truly representing the people who probably voted for them.
Right.
It's just a question of, did everybody get to vote?
Right.
And the big corporations and those big corporations that perpetuate this stuff. And like you're saying, Nancy, because one of the things I do is I look at who's buying that politician, who's given them money to run again. That's a big thing. And when you're dealing with corporations, look at the things that they support and who they support. That's enormous. I mean, this is a huge concern. There are places I will not go because I know who they supported.
Right.
I will not buy their products. I refuse, and people think I'm silly, but no, thank you. They're not getting my money. That's all there is to it. Because I have a conscience.
I'm mindful of our time, so this is a great conversation.
I need to leave. I'm really sorry, but this was a wonderful discussion. Thanks to everybody.
Obviously, we're preaching to the choir here, but so share your knowledge with other people, and we will try to continue this. Let me offer a closing prayer. Holy God, we are confronted with some overwhelming problems that we are facing this day, and continue to help us to be mindful and to be creative and outgoing in sharing our voices and what we think, prod us out of any indecision we might be experiencing, and help us to transform the systems and structures that perpetuate poverty in our day. We pray this in your name. Amen. Well, blessings to you all. Thank you for joining in the conversation. And we'll
on to football and the World Series.
Job.
All right.
Bye-bye.